but it was just academic now. She patted her pocket that contained the innocuous piece of broken pottery, knowing that she would be despised by more than just a few wizards for possessing it. It didn't matter, though. The answer lay on a different path. Cecilia turned just as another train raced along the track, and took a few steps back inside the tent, smiling to herself as Mr. Weasley and Shacklebolt scribbled down something on what looked suspiciously like an engine number parchment. 4:15, said Mr. Weasley to Shacklebolt as he wrote down the time, before looking at Cecilia. "Oh, here you are," he said, handing Cecilia another towel. This one was warm and soft, and Cecilia held it to her chest, gratefully. "Thank you," she said, "both of you." Cecilia smiled at them both before holding out her hand towards Kingsley Shacklebolt, who took it carefully, jerking his arm as she shook it. "Well, Mrs. Frobisher," said Mr. Weasley, tapping her on the shoulder. "You have what you need, and our information. What are you going to do now?" 88,888,888. "Mr. Weasley, are you sure this isn't dangerous?" Cecilia's shouted words hit her back in the face as the wind whipped past her face. The ground below her seemed to be traveling at speed, and although she felt relatively safe on the back of a magical broomstick traveling north at speed behind Arthur Weasley, there was another thought at the back of her mind, urgent and strong, that was trying to tell her hindbrain that perhaps this wasn't absolutely the best mode of transport back to Hogwarts. To the left of them, Kingsley Shacklebolt banked and made a passing dive, something akin to a move Cecilia had witnessed the Gryffindor Quidditch team attempt, and he came in next to her. "All right, Mrs. Frobisher?" he shouted above the wind. "Getting used to it now?" Cecilia nodded, because that was all she could do. There wasn't enough air in her lungs to tell Shacklebolt that actually, she was feeling a little nervous and perhaps they could set down in the nearest town and return by train. "We're just over Leicester, look," he continued, pointing down past the handle of his broomstick and below them in the dusk light. Cecilia swallowed, looking tentatively down at the houses below her which formed themselves into streets and towns. She looked where Kingsley was pointing and she could just make out arterial roads in the growing darkness. Confined spaces was her irrational fear, but, having never before attempted to fly 600 miles on the back of an open-topped broomstick before, this may well yet vie for joint first place. "Hold on, Cecilia," called Mr. Weasley as they began to bank higher. "We're in for a bit of turbulence in a few moments. Nothing at all to worry about," he added cheerily. Turbulence. Well, she hoped her bags would be okay, hung by the straps like they were from the brush part of Shacklebolt's broom. She glanced from them to the wizard in front of them, and he gave her a wink. "I remember my first broom ride. I was 6. Loved it, I did. Absolutely loved it." And with that, he zoomed forward, level with Mr. Weasley, throwing her a reassuring smile. "Yes, but I'm not a wizard," thought Cecilia. "When I was 6 the only thing I rode was a bike." She held tighter onto Mr. Weasley as the wind buffeted them head-on and they rose higher until the motorway, down which she had travelled with Gary the articulated lorry driver that morning, shrank to a yellowy-white ribbon as they soared high above the ground. Her mind began to drift. Raymond Lully. So he had worked with the scientists then, and got almost as near as she had by the sounds of it. If he had just avoided employing Oswald Avery, none of this would have happened. Maybe even Voldemort would not have arisen. She continued to look ahead, at the full moon below the clouds, shining on the flyers as they soared through the night. She saw Mr. Weasley lean over towards Kingsley and say something as they continued forward. But the answer to why Voldemort had arisen was never that simple. Cecilia was a scientist, and knew that even with 3 variables in a problem to be solved could manifest themselves into a myriad of independent concerns, every one of them part of the result, and without just one, the result would be different. There were so many different factors. Cecilia's mind drifted to the phone conversation with Nick. Looking back, it was clear he didn't want to speak to her, didn't want even to acknowledge her, even though he hadn't seen her for months. Was it the same with Libby? Was that the reason she wasn't home when Cecilia had called her early that afternoon? Were all these people she knew growing apart from her, because of the path she had chosen? Because of this? They all had their own lives to lead, and were leading them without her. Without her, Amy was coming in from another temp job, throwing on the kettle and phoning her friend to tell her about the hottest crush in the office while she simultaneously flicked through the next catalogue. Without her, Libby was cooking dinner for her family, driving Freya to school and going to Sainsbury's, kissing Derek hello when he came in that evening. Without her, lessons were being taught, science was being discussed. Without her, Mother was collecting more curios and ephemera to add to her already well-stocked display cabinet. Without her. Was this the turning point in her life? Just like recruiting Avery to the Reciprocators was Lully's? Were the minutes after thinking these thoughts, when Mr. Weasley left her at Hogwarts and she went back inside the school gates and tracked down Severus and continued perfecting the potion, the minutes that would have made her fit back into the Cecilia-shaped space back in Edgeford if she had made a different choice? How long would it be before everyone at home had moved on, and she was no longer a part of their lives? And then what? When they had finished the potion, what was the alternative? Attempting to live in the wizard world, with the open prejudice and hatred, even amongst those loyal to Dumbledore? Remain at Hogwarts to teach a subject to wizard children under the guise of a squib? Be pursued in the name of the curse that had been put on her by Sirius Black? The broom began to drop a little in the air, and the edge of a cloud clipped Cecilia's arm, causing her now dry jacket sleeve to become wet again. Ahead of her, Mr. Weasley said something to Shacklebolt, who dropped his broom back to Cecilia's level. Arthur said he's sorry about that, he shouted at Cecilia. She turned her head in his direction and nodded. We're about an hour and a half away, continued Kingsley, tapping his wrist where a watch might be. Cecilia nodded again, watching as he pulled further forward, turning his head to speak to Mr. Weasley. Sirius Black. Never had she witnessed such open hatred. And he was supposed to be on the side of the Order. Parts of her could understand his actions, those motivated by love of Harry. But what she could not explain was the premeditated, calculated method of his destruction of her, which he had been plotting for months. And, come to that, what had the other wizards done? With the exception of Mr. Weasley and Shacklebolt that afternoon, there was only Snape who had actually made an effort to distance himself from Black's actions, even making some attempt at pacification when Remus left. Remus. As Cecilia thought his name, she felt her heart beat faster as Christmas Eve replayed itself in her mind. What a lovely, kind man. A wonderful man that she had trusted and chosen to trust intimately. A wizard nonetheless who had let her down almost as badly as Sirius Black. Fighting the urge to cry self-indulgent tears, Cecilia looked down past her leg and tried to calculate where they must be. An hour and a half away. Could that be York down there? Even Harry Potter, technically still a child at 15, had begun to show his true feelings. And he was the person she had given so much of her time and so much of herself to protect. When Voldemort was eventually defeated, if she were to stay at Hogwarts as a teacher, that type of hatred would be in her classroom every day. The wind whipped her already bedraggled and messy hair as Arthur Weasley skirted round a wall of cloud, and she held on tighter as the bitter wind caused tears to form in her eyes anyway. The information she had come by that afternoon replayed itself in Cecilia's mind as their flight continued, its implications seeping into her brain as she dwelt on different pieces of information, new pieces that actually became important, and dismissing those less important until she had a new picture in her mind of what she was dealing with. And as they began to dip lower between the mountains that surrounded the grounds of Hogwarts, A good few minutes earlier than Shacklebolt had predicted, a strategy was taking shape around the seed of inspiration that her mind had begotten that afternoon. 88,888,888. Cecilia closed her eyes as Mr. Weasley landed heavily on rough grass between the Forbidden Forest and Hagrid's hut. Kingsley had flown near her just before they descended and instructed her that they must land there to remain as inconspicuous as possible, and that when they got nearer the ground, she should bend her knees and place the soles of her feet flat down. Marveling at how lovely the castle looked from the air in the still of the night, Cecilia almost forgot the instruction, and she was propelled a little way forward, landing clumsily on an ankle. "There we are. Up we come," said Arthur Weasley, catching her by both hands and swinging her to her feet. "I expect you'll be glad to be back, Cecilia, eh? To get your your research sorted out." He smiled expectantly, and Cecilia nodded. She was in no mood to argue, or tried to explain to Mr. Weasley that the first thing she would be doing was having a nice hot soak. "Thank you, Mr. Weasley," she said, "and Mr. Shacklebolt," she added as Kingsley handed her both her bags. "I never knew broom flight would be so exhilarating." "Well, it is indeed an honor to be escorting such a distinguished lady as yourself," he replied. He looked at Kingsley Shacklebolt. "Now, Kingsley, you're welcome to be off. I can escort Mrs. Frobisher back to the castle gates," he continued, looking at Cecilia proudly. "Thank you for carrying my bags," she said to Shacklebolt as he picked up his broom and stood it vertically next to him. "My pleasure," he replied, leaning forward and touching her on the shoulder. "Now, whatever it is you have planned, take it steady. And just remember, the information I have given to you is not to be shared. Your life would be in serious danger otherwise." "Of course," said Cecilia, nodding, before stepping back quickly as Shacklebolt clicked his fingers. A flash of light and a crack followed as the wizard disapparated. "I thought that was impossible inside Hogwarts," said Cecilia, grabbing her bags. She was about to put them on her shoulder when Mr. Weasley relieved her of them, tossing them over his and beginning to walk up the escarpment in the direction of the castle. "Oh, it is," he replied, chuckling a little to himself. "But we weren't in the grounds." He pointed to a ring of stones that flickered as they approached. "They mark the boundary of the grounds," he said, stopping as he spoke. "These small rocks. Edgestones. When we cross over these, Dumbledore will be alerted to our presence, as he was when you passed over them last night. Which is why I must leave you here. I do not wish my presence to be well known." He tapped his nose. "The Ministry?" she asked. Mr. Weasley frowned. "Mrs. Weasley," he replied weakly. "And the Ministry, of course." Cecilia knelt down by the edgestones. They looked like any other rocks that littered the igneous landscape around the castle. And she had been out here at night before and never noticed them. "Steady now, Mrs. Frobisher," warned Mr. Weasley. "They have been known to bite people that touch them." "They're alive?" she asked in disbelief, jerking her hand away quickly. "Not really. But they have a strange lifelike force. A community. They work together as a collective, and if one is touched then they attack." He smiled. United Rocks, thought Cecilia, mystified. "Well, I suppose anything's possible." "Thank you, Mr. Weasley," she said, holding out her hand. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." "The pleasure is all mine, Mrs. Frobisher," he replied, shaking it vigorously. "To have been train-spotting with a mole." His eyes glazed over in apparent bliss. "Anyway," he continued, coming back down to earth. "Good night." Cecilia turned to go, as did Mr. Weasley, and she picked up her 2 bags, placing them on her shoulder. Back to work then, she thought as a wave of glumness passed over her before her mind reminded her of her half-formed plan and her spirits lifted slightly. As she was about to step over the edgestones, Cecilia stopped. A figure, running at full pelt out of the west gate entrance of the castle, caught her eye. At the same time as she recognized the figure, she felt a pair of hands on her shoulders pulling her to the ground. "Get down!" he hissed, lying next to her. A hand pressed on her back. "We need to get back. Shuffle back," he continued, inching his way back towards the steep slope they had climbed. Cecilia pressed herself low to the damp earth and moved slowly backwards until her feet met fresh air. "Quickly, Cecilia. There's not enough time." Once she was behind the slope, Mr. Weasley put a finger to his lips before withdrawing his wand. "Severus," she began. "Death Eaters," she insisted, but Mr. Weasley hushed her, holding his wand erect. And only 100 yards in front of them the assembled Death Eaters crowded round Snape. He stood in the middle of 8 of them before one stepped forward. Cecilia could barely stand lying here listening as they tortured him. His screams were blood-curdling and, once or twice, she turned her face to the earth and put her hands over her ears. Mr. Weasley placed a comforting hand on her back. "And she is safe. You are keeping her safe for the Dark Lord?" Crucio. The words began to strike in Cecilia's mind. Were they talking about her? Was Snape being tortured by the Death Eaters, like she had seen them do to another last October? Tortured because of her? Is this what he endured when he went out of the castle? What she had tried to mend before? How long had they known all about her? Cecilia tried to shuffle further up the bank, but Mr. Weasley held her back. "There's nothing you can do," he whispered urgently. "Stay down." That information was correct. Bellatrix. He is to keep her safe until the weapon is brought to the Dark Lord. That is a lie, Wormtail. Why would he have any reason to lie? Cecilia recognized Snape's voice, low and gravelly, but faltering. "Oh yes, like the good old days. Yes, mulbating. Women are always the best. You are to extract the information you need. Lucius." Cecilia heard Snape manage. "That is all." "All?" Cecilia heard Lucius Malfoy laugh. The same laugh when she was sitting in the bank. The same intonation when she had seen the Death Eaters in October, when he had enjoyed the torture of one of their kind. "But you know there is more than one way to make her scream, Professor Snape. And we prefer it to a confession." "Not let my sister hear you say that." The voice of a woman, thin and reedy, filled the night. "The weapon. Is that not the most important?" Again Snape's voice, deep but disjointed. So, that was the plan. Cecilia raised her head further up to catch more of the conversation. Severus's cover was that she was going to bring the potion to the Death Eaters, and admit how it worked. Cecilia felt herself begin to shiver, and it was nothing to do with the climate. "If you have no attachment to her, Snape, why are you so reluctant to bring her?" "But, oh," the female voice, in sing-song mocking, pierced the air again, "I really don't think that any of us believe for a minute that Severus Snape has no attachment. And for this. You were absent from the mole's home. During the Christmas festival." Crucio. Blue-white light flashed again in the long distance and she heard Snape scream. Cecilia could not bear it any longer. She could not stand to hear him being tortured on her account. She could stop this. "Stay where you are," she heard Mr. Weasley say, his hand on her arm. "You can do nothing for him now." Feeling tears of anger and sadness on her face, Cecilia turned to the damp, dirty earth again, covering her ears with her hands. Half an hour later, they had gone and Mr. Weasley was pulling her towards him frantically as she tried to climb the escarpment. No. There could still be Death Eaters. "I don't care," Cecilia shouted, her voice cracked and dry. She clambered up and over the edge of the hill, trying in the darkness to find Snape. "Cecilia." Mr. Weasley was behind her, his wand raised defensively, and Cecilia stopped dead. "It's all right," he said, noticing her reaction to his raised wand. "Let me check how safe it is. Then we can look for him. You knows." But there was no need to search far in the deserted grounds for Severus Snape. A dark mound lay a few feet away from them, its features illuminated by the dim light of Mr. Weasley's wand. Cecilia felt her stomach lurch and she stumbled towards Snape. Nothing could have prepared Cecilia for the sight she was about to see. On approaching him, she saw that Snape's limbs were twitching uncontrollably, as if he had been electrocuted. The flesh she could see was red and blistered, as if it had seared off in places, and when she tried to touch his shoulder, he pushed her away violently. As he did so, he turned his head and Cecilia gasped in horror at the damage to his features. Cecilia warned Mr. Weasley, but she ignored him, kneeling beside him. They tortured him, the bastards. The ones from whom he was protecting her. They brought him to within inches of his life. They tortured him for taking her out of danger's way and back to Hogwarts. "Lie still." She risked putting the back of her hand against his forehead. This time he didn't move and her hand became saturated with hot sweat. Oh God! If they didn't do something soon, he would soon be dead. "We're going to get you to Poppy," she whispered, wondering how exactly she was going to do that. "Mr. Weasley, stay with him. I'm going to get—" Cecilia didn't finish her sentence as she raced in the darkness over the ground, over the edge-stones before stumbling over a tuft of earth. Picking herself up, she hobbled a few more steps before banging hard on the door of Hagrid's hut. "Be in!" she shouted at the door. "Be in! You look in for me?" A voice behind Cecilia made her turn quickly. Hagrid was standing behind her, arms folded. "Oh, Hagrid!" she exclaimed, exhaling with relief. "Am I glad to see you?" In the moonlight, Hagrid nodded. "I dare say," he replied, nodding slowly. "And I expect I would be wantin' to say the same thing myself, but first I got to ask you, Mrs. Frobisher. Have you been gone to Godric's Hollow?" The look in his eyes made Cecilia shiver. She couldn't lie to Hagrid. "Yes, but dash. I see. I went, but—" Cecilia tried again, wanting to explain to the giant. "You went to Godric's Hollow for hexperimenting," he declared, folding his arms tighter. "Desecrating Harry Potter's memory." "I went to Godric's Hollow, but listen." Cecilia stopped as Hagrid's look of betrayal penetrated her mind. She expected as much. And if she hadn't made her decision, it would probably be justified. "Hagrid, I don't care what you think of me. I didn't come here for me. It's Severus. Professor Snape. He's going to die unless we get him to Poppy. I can't carry him myself." Her voice trailed off as Hagrid began to pace in the direction of the edge-stones and she hurried to follow him. When they returned to Snape, under the dim light of Mr. Weasley's wand, Cecilia could see he had grown much worse. His pallor, not bright at the best of times, was dull, almost ashen. Snape's limbs had stopped twitching on their own accord, but now his arms lay awkwardly, limp and weak. "We need to get him to the hospital wing," insisted Cecilia as she dropped beside Snape again. "Poppy will make you well," she whispered, kissing him quickly on his forehead. "I'll take it from here, Mr. Weasley," said Hagrid, looking between Cecilia and Mr. Weasley for a second. "Certainly, Hagrid," Mr. Weasley replied. "I'll wait here until I see you safe in the castle," he added, smiling briefly at Cecilia before stepping out of the way of the giant as Hagrid bent to pick up Snape. Heaving him into his arms, Hagrid turned and began to stride quickly towards the castle. Cecilia made to go after them. "Don't forget your bags," said Mr. Weasley, handing them to her. "Thanks," said Cecilia quickly, smiling at him before hurrying after the Hagrid as he disappeared into the darkness. And as Cecilia Frobisher stumbled and fell in the moonlit darkness of the Hogwarts grounds, following an angry giant and an almost dead wizard, her new plan flicked into her mind fully formed, like a summer breeze flitting on the water of a lake. Tailing behind Hagrid, watching him carry Snape in through the West Tower, watching the door swing firmly behind him causing Cecilia to have to take the front entrance, hurrying wearily up the stairs and avoiding students and staff, it replayed like a perfect song on a loop. Rushing up to the second floor, and along the dimly lit corridor, through nearly headless Nick, ignoring the screams of outrage behind her, past other students, into the hospital wing. She did not have the first idea about how she would accomplish it. Insisting forcefully to Poppy that she must remain, refusing to retire to her room, ignoring Hagrid's words of derision, and kneeling beside Snape's bed, dismissing threats of the headmaster being called. As she looked upon the broken body of Severus Snape, broken on her behalf again, for once, Cecilia Frobisher knew exactly what she must do.